The Okanagan Valley is a prime agricultural area in BC used mainly for growing fruits and vegetables which flourished in the hot summer climate. The farming industry was a great showcase of how Euro-Canadian social, economic, and political structures replaced the First Nations people. The interior Salish language family's traditional economy composed of a variety of food and materials throughout the mountains, valleys, and series of long, narrow lakes that run through the north and south corridor. The settlers arrived in the 1880s. The people that lived in the Okanagan were already taking part in agricultural methods. One of these methods was stock raising, for they had been breeding and keeping horses for a century and a half prior to new settlers. The horses they kept were beneficial because they made long trading journeys easier and were compatible to the flexible nature of gathering resources. In more recent years, people had been well educated on how to grow fruits and vegetables from the Hudson's Bay Company posts, which all had gardens. First Nations had been growing potatoes since the beginning of the 1840s. During the 1860s, miners and farmers had squatted on traditional sites and began to move into the Okanagan Valley. In order to dodge conflict between First Nations and newcomers, Governor James Douglas negotiated peace agreements between the Okanagan people and the other interior people. Okanagan chiefs agreed to permit Europeans to share the land and resources, but only if they were allowed to continue their traditional hunting and fishing. Land reserves were put in place for the Okanagan people. These plots of land provided space for cattle raising, farming, and hunting. Substantial land reserves were marked out by local lands commissioner William Cox, due to the fact that most of the flat land around the ends of the Okanagan Lake were included in land reserves, traditional villages, fishing camps, and gardens. At that time, conditions were more absolute than before the Europeans settled there. Opportunities rose, not only for their traditional economies, but to take part in the new economy they desired. It became apparent that the Okanagan people were nothing but an obstacle instead of owners of the land which they negotiated. In 1866, all the Okanagan land reserves had dwindled down to half the size. Douglas retired, and a man named Joseph Turch filled his position. The reserves marked out by Cox were ignored, and local magistrate named Haynes placed much smaller and less valuable lands. Ranching became a key way of life in the Okanagan during the last decades of the 1800s. Settlers could obtain tracts of half-grass covering hills for grazing. And a ranch near Coldstream, Vernon, allowed Earl of Aberdeen a great impact on the development of agriculture in the Okanagan. He initiated change that would come, encouraging settlers of the orchard industry and building irrigation systems. Hotberries were one of the crops grown at Coldstream that would be handled to Britain. The Okanagan people were the major workforce that they depended on laborers to pick hops. Families came from Lytton and as far as eastern Washington. These families gathered at hop farms for a month or so during early September. Aberdeen maintained economic control, which kept wages circulating in the community. First Nations weren't paid in cash but in coupons printed with different denotations which could be used at local stores. By the 20th century, the cattle industry was depleting. Grasslands were overgrazing, making it a challenge to feed the animals. Settlers were piling in, dividing the lands into smaller sections with fences dividing them. During this time, fruit farming became a form of agriculture in the valley. A profitable orchard must have water. In hot, dry summers, irrigation systems were indispensable. The upcoming years, access water played a role in the ability of the Okanagan people who participated in the industry. By the 1890s, the Okanagan people were skilled farmers who cultivated land and grew a wide variety of crops. Much of what they produced was used, and what was left was simply profit. By the 1890s, more people had turned to farming, and fields were extended to the point where there was no room left on the reserves, but because of the laws governing the First Nations, they were unable to gain additional land. During a shortage of land, a shortage of capital interest in fruit farmings was a burden to agricultural development in the Okanagan Valley. The provincial government controlled water rights under the British Columbia Act, and licenses for water were denied to anybody who did not own their own land. This meaning that since the Okanagan people were under the Indian Act, they were unable to own their own land, seeing as they were considered children of the state. In most cases, people were thrown in jail because they defied law and used water to save their crops. The Okanagan people had to settle as working laborers on the farms of the new settlers. The farmers depended on them to do much of the work they needed to send fruit to the market, pick the berries, and can them.
Done?
Turn it off!
Woo!